Before I begin today's list, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who has shown their support so far. It really means a lot to me that we've just broken 50 subscribers, and I know it may not be a huge number to some people, but to me, it means everything. So, thank you. Hello everyone, my name is Mrpyfer, and today we'll take a more in-depth look into the 5 most haunted places in Ohio. Part 2. Number 5. Moonville Tunnel. Deep in the backwoods of Vinton County stands the Moonville Tunnel, a relic from an era long gone. There have been over 28 recorded deaths connected directly to the tunnel, and most of the residents of Moonville, which are buried on a hill in the area, are rumored to still walk along the tracks to this day. From satanic rituals containing being born in the tunnel, to the infamous Brakeman tale, there are a number of stories connected to this paranormal site. While no names are ever given, the most complete version regarding the Moonville ghost is the one regarding an epidemic that had swept through the town. As a result, the entire town of Moonville was quarantined. Trains were ordered not to stop in Moonville anymore. Low on supplies, the people in Moonville came up with a plan. They would send one of their own through the Moonville Tunnel to the outskirts of town with a lantern. The idea was that as the train approached, the man would signal for help with his lantern. Since he wouldn't be standing outside the town's limits, the thought was that the conductor would stop the train and help. The plan having been developed, a volunteer was selected, and it was decided that he would set out the following day. However, the next day, the volunteer got off to a late start, either because he overslept or was sleeping hungover, and as he neared the tunnel, he heard the train approaching. Knowing the train would never stop for him unless he was on the other side of the tunnel and outside the town's limits, the man began sprinting through the darkness, waving his lantern wildly. Sadly, the man never made it through the tunnel as he was struck and killed instantly by the oncoming train. This is why people report seeing a ghost lantern walking along the track bed around the old tunnel. At night, you can see lights going by. Rocks from the top of the tunnel have been said to fly down and try to hit you. The Moonville Cemetery isn't far from the tunnel, and there was rumors of people trying to go up and having this sensation like something is trying to make you go back down. Number 4. Prospect Place. I've already spoken about this legendary place of paranormal activity in my previous 5 most haunted places in Ohio, but as I stated in that video, I was not able to cover the entire story like I wanted. Until now. George Adams came to Ohio from Virginia in 1808. His father had been a prosperous plantation owner with more than 500 acres of land in Farquhar and Loudoun counties, a large number of slaves, and a tremendous fortune. With the death of his young father, when George was a young man, he inherited the entire estate and proceeded to do something that few Virginia gentlemen of the time would have done. He sold the plantation and freed his slaves. Adams was a devout Christian and abolitionist, and believed that for one man to own another was a sin against God. He took the money from the sale of the plantation and purchased a large tract of land in Ohio, as well as wagons and provisions to move west to this new land. Ohio had been entered into the Union as a free state in 1803 and offered great promise in the eyes of the young man. The family, which consisted of his wife and daughter, whose names have been lost to history, and his 2 sons Samuel and Edward, and a young son George Wilson, arrived in Ohio after 9 months of departing from Virginia. This region was still a frontier at that time, and aside from the famed Cumberland Road, there were few good trails. Harsh weather conditions forced them to find shelter from the winter and continue their journey in the spring. They eventually settled near the eastern side of Muskingum River, near the tiny village of Drenson in central Ohio. At the time, Drenson was a little more than a collection of homes and a few businesses, but as the century progressed, it became a wealthy community of merchants along with what was one of the most important trade routes of the time, the Ohio and Erie Canal. The canal was constructed just north of Drenson in the 1830s and opened the town to business from all over the world. It would play an important part in the life and business interest of the Adams family. Not long after the canal was completed, George Adams died, and the 150 acres that he had purchased in Ohio was passed on to his sons. In the years that followed his inheriting of Prospect Place, William Cox spent huge amounts of money re-innovating the mansion and throwing huge parties and gals on the grounds in the floor of the grand ballroom on the top floor. In 1886 alone, he installed a new floor in the main hall and replaced the tin barn roof with one of copper. The parties hosted at Prospect Place became known far and wide at one reception, held for a new Episcopal bishop with over 200 people in attendance. Ice cream was served for the very first time in Muskingum County. Cox had commissioned a special refrigerator train to deliver it there to the party. There were whispers and rumors about the amounts of money that Cox was spending, but none of them were taken seriously until one day shortly after the turn of the last century. On a Friday afternoon in November, he informed his family that he was going to Zanesville on business, and vanished without a trace. For days afterward, Cox's family and the local authorities attempted to unravel the mystery of his disappearance. By all indications, he disappeared under his own power and left several strange and contradictory clues behind. Anna even hired a detective to find and track him down, but he found nothing. According to the witnesses that he interviewed, Cox had checked into the hotel in the company of a man that he refused to register. He and the clerk argued over the matter, which is why the man remembered the incident at all. He gave a good description of the strange man, but the clue led nowhere. Until a letter arrived for Anna one day a few months later. The letter that arrived came from a young woman named Jenny Adams, who had grown up in Drenson but had moved to San Francisco several years before. She wrote that she had been walking a few days before and that William Cox had passed her on the street. Some suggested that perhaps William was a homosexual in a time less open than ours, and that perhaps the mysterious man was his lover. The two of them may have left Ohio thinking they would never be seen again. Officially, William Cox and the strange man were never seen again. I highly recommend you check out the links I have listed in the description for this place, as it goes fully into the history and all of the events that have taken place since it was built. Number 3. Little Sugar Creek. Many years ago, the small town of Bellbrook, which is located near Dayton, acquired quite a reputation for stories of ghosts. In fact, it was nicknamed Ohio's Sleepy Hollow by local residents. Outside of the town, along Little Sugar Creek Road and near Maggie Park, is a small river called Little Sugar Creek. It is said to be haunted by 2 different ghosts, with 2 different stories to tell. The first ghost is that of an Englishman named James Buckley, who built a sawmill on the creek, which was then known as Possum Run Creek. Buckley managed to become quite wealthy and was envied by many who lived in the area. Then one morning, his cabin was raided and his money disappeared. Buckley was killed in the attack and his body was found outside, minus his head. That portion of his anatomy was found a short distance away, bloody and covered with dirt and mud. The murderer was never caught, and Buckley's death remains unsolved to this day. As time passed, many started to claim that his cabin was haunted and it was avoided by the people in that area. Years passed and it was finally rented to a couple from nearby Dayton, until the young woman saw Buckley's ghost, with his head under his arm, standing in the doorway to the house. It is believed that his ghost still haunts the area of the creek where the sawmill was located today, and many claim to have seen his ghost holding out his arms as if asking for help. The other ghost haunts in the area of the creek where Maggie Park is located today. She is the spirit of a young girl who died there many years ago in a tragic suicide. In the 1880s, the influential mayor of Bellbrook became involved in an affair with a young servant girl whom he seduced. When she found herself pregnant, he ordered her from his house, and heartbroken, she was forced to get by as a prostitute to support herself. The girl was the main source of gossip for people in that town. They knew that she had gotten herself into trouble, but they didn't know with whom. The baby was born early, and the girl refused to tell anybody who the father was. She only left the house after dark. The baby's face was covered, because it was said to resemble the father's so much that she didn't allow it to be seen. Many believe that the girl had lost her mind as they began to see her walking along the banks of Little Sugar Creek, singing and talking to a bundle of rags that clothed her baby. Finally, one June night, she returned to the mayor's house, hoping that if he saw the child, he might take pity on her, and if he didn't accept the baby, at least he might try to give her something to eat. Needless to say, she never even saw him as the door was slammed in her face by a servant. She wrapped the baby close to her and jumped off the bridge into the creek. A week later, 2 boys found her body washed onto the riverbank. Her arms were still tightly gripping the old shawl, but the baby was gone. It is now said that on foggy nights in June, the ghost of the servant girl walks along the banks of the creek. She softly sings to the bundle in her arms as she stumbles along. Number 2. HELLTOWN. HELLTOWN is a nickname given to the northern part of Summit County. The areas most often associated with the HELLTOWN legend are Boston Township and Boston Village, as well as portions of Sagamore Hills and Northfield Center Townships. These areas are often combined into one large region, which is commonly referred to as Boston Mills. Settled in 1806, Boston stands as the oldest village in Summit County. The first mill was built in the village in the early 1820s. Several years later, the construction of the Ohio and Erie Canal brought more people to Boston, and over the next few decades, mills began to flourish in the area, most notably a paper mill. When a railroad station was constructed in the town in the early 1880s, the station was named Boston Mills in reference to the paper mill. In the late 1960s, a nationwide movement began that expressed concern over the destruction of our forest. In response, President Ford signed legislation in 1974 that enabled the National Park Services to purchase land and use it to create national parks. On December 27, 1974, hundreds of acres of land, including some within the township of Boston, were officially designated a National Recreation Area. Many people did not realize that this legislation gave the federal government the power to use the right of eminent domain to acquire land from private owners in order to clear the way for the national park. But almost immediately after the bill was passed, the government began purchasing houses throughout Boston Township and the surrounding area. Once the government decided to buy a property, there was no negotiation involved. The owners were forced to relocate. Residents began leaving in droves, and entire townships were swallowed up by the Cuyahoga Valley National Park. These events were so tragic that they were featured in the 1983 PBS documentary, For the Good of All. Perhaps the general feelings of the displaced homeowners were best summed up in a statement found scrawled across the wall of a vacant home. Now we felt how the Indians felt. With the government buying land and residents' houses by the acres, there was a well-known theory of what was happening at the time. The theory is that there was a government cover-up to hide the fact that they spilled deadly chemicals in the area. These chemicals could have caused bizarre mutations to the area residents and their children. But stories regarding a government conspiracy refer to the area where the chemicals were spilt as either Butane Town, or Mutant Town. The first two named after the chemicals said to have been spilled, and the last describing the results of the alleged spill. Records show that there was never any chemical spill of any type in that area. These stories were most likely to explain the various U.S. government signs on the abandoned buildings. Number 1. Tinker Creek. Mostly hidden among a tree-covered, glacier-carved landscape, Tinker Creek remains largely untouched by human hands. Some of those who have attempted to settle this land barely left a trace of their own existence. Today, many visitors to this strange area have reported strange occurrences. Eerie sounds, lights, and shadows. The uncanny sense of being chased away and even followed. Historical records prior to the 20th century are sparse. An Ottawa tribe resided on the land sometime prior to 1786. It is not known how long the Ottawas occupied the land, but what is known is that they were suddenly abandoned their huts and left the area. Their escape may have been due to encroaching white settlers from New England, or from growing hostility by other nearby Native American tribes. In the late spring of 1786, a Moravian mission came upon the abandoned Ottawa settlement. Fleeing persecution, the Moravians, led by David Zeisberger and John Heckewelder, decided to make this part of the Cuyahoga Valley their home. They named the land Mrpyfer. The Moravians planted crops and built cabins and a church. They did not intend to make this their permanent home, but something happened while they were there that caused them to leave even sooner. A nearby tribe recommended they stay at Mrpyfer, but for reasons unknown, the Moravians decided to move on as quickly as possible. Only 10 months after they had settled at Mrpyfer, and as soon as spring broke in 1787, the Moravians gathered for a prayer on the banks of the nearby creek and walked away. 10 years later, in 1797, members of the Connecticut Western Revere Land Company arrived to survey the land for permanent settlement by pioneers from New England. There, they discovered the ruins of the Moravian ghost town. They renamed the area Tinker's Creek, after the survey team's principal boatman, Joseph Tinker. Unfortunately for Tinker, the curse of Mrpyfer would continue. Shortly after leaving Tinker's Creek, on his return to New England, Joseph Tinker drowned along with his 2 companions. Since its official establishment, Tinker Creek has enjoyed an uneasy history. Few white settlers actually resided in Tinker's Creek, and instead settled in nearby Bedford and Northville Township. However, when these settlers had to bury someone of their first dead, they chose an isolated, out-of-the-way plot of land located atop a hill in Tinker's Creek. Although it is not confirmed that this is the cemetery used to be the burial grounds for the Owadas, it has historically been referred to as Old Indian Cemetery. That cemetery is now commonly known as Tinker's Creek. Despite it being a peaceful beauty, this abandoned graveyard is widely reported to be haunted. Also known as Terra Vista Cemetery, Hillside Cemetery, and Pilgrim Cemetery, this burial ground is the site of accounts of evil dark shadow figures, paranormal phenomenon, and even occult activity. In the northwest section of the cemetery, this strange circles of headstones was found. Some say it resembles the crude shape of a pentagram. This broken tombstone marks the grave of a Comstock family pioneer believed to be one of the first white burials in this cemetery. He died in 1810 at the age of 40. While his name is mostly illegible, the inscription near the bottom reads, "Adieu to all things here below. Vain world, I leave thy fleeting toys. Adieu to sin, fear, and pain and woe, and welcome bright, eternal joys." As large as this cemetery is, very few tombstones remain. It is speculated that Tinker Creek Cemetery was also used as a massive gravesite for Irish canal workers who died from malaria and other diseases while digging the Ohio and Erie Canal in the 1820s around Tinker Creek. Many surrounding townships and villages would not, or for financial reasons could not, accept the bodies for burial in their cemeteries. As a result, many of the canal workers were buried in paupers' graves, or within the walls of the canal itself. Around Valley View, some of those workers were also buried in the old Valley View Cemetery, since destroyed by the highway development in the 1970s. Of the few settlers who did choose to live in Tinker Creek, some have reported seeing strange and eerie shadow figures approaching gravestones and sitting there for hours upon end, until only leaving when somebody approaches, or when the dusk comes to arise. If you enjoyed today's list, please leave a like or a comment and let me know what video you want done next. Now, I just wanted to give a special thank you to everyone who helped with this list. A few amazing subscribers helped me create this list by providing links and resources, so I couldn't have done it without you. I also wanted to say I'm so sorry for taking over 3 weeks to make this second part, but with everything else going on in my life, I wasn't able to make it until now, and I wanted to make sure that this video would come out the best I could make it for you guys. And also, anyone who's interested in learning more about these and other paranormal sites in Ohio, please look down in the description below for a plethora of resources of paranormal activity in Ohio. Now, as always, stay safe.